How can you be so optimistic at a time like this?
For almost 250 years, our country has had moments of progress and moments of setbacks, but we have continuously moved toward a more perfect union. I think one of the lessons of history is it doesn't happen by itself. It requires all of us to work toward, bending that moral art. What is it? The arc of the universe, it bends toward justice, but it requires us to bend it. And I have faith in the American people.
Barbara McQuade, welcome to San Francisco.
Thank you.
I've got a little housekeeping to start with. Welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Neil Chase. I'm the CEO at CalMatters. A couple of quick reminders, no surprises. This program is being recorded. Please make sure your cell phones are off. And if you have questions for Barb, and who doesn't, really, write them down. There are cards available that you can write them on. If you're joining us online through YouTube, you can do it through the YouTube chat. We will pepper you with questions from the audience shortly. And now I get to introduce my friend Barbara McQuade. She is a professor from practice at the University of Michigan Law School. The University of Michigan, home to, I believe, the national champion basketball team. Is that correct?
Don't forget it, go blue.
Let me just cross my legs here. And the greatest college newspaper in the world, the Michigan Daily.
Michigan Daily.
No applause. One person. Barb, of course, went to Michigan. She teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, national security, and data privacy. Kind of important stuff these days. She's also a legal analyst for NBC News and MS Now, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody in the room. And she co-hosts the very popular Sisters in Law podcast with Joyce Vance, Jill Wine-Banks, and Kim Atkins-Storr. Barb was the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, appointed by President Obama in 2010, and served in that role for 7 years through 2017. One thing you will find reading this book, The Fix, those were really bad years to break a federal law in the state of Michigan. I mean, just one case after another. With you didn't want to be up against Barb. This new book, The Fix, Saving America from the Corruption of a Mob-Style Government, is her expose on the threat of what's going on right now with the far-right politics, and perhaps the best part, what we do about it, and some hope as to how we're going to get out of this. So Barb, welcome back to the Commonwealth Club. Welcome back to San Francisco. And let's get started. I love reading the book, no surprise. Even though the title is The Fix, the first 2/3 of it or so are about what's broken, what went wrong. And it felt a little bit like a prosecutor building a case. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's fair. Well, I will gladly answer your question, but before I do, may I just say how delighted I am to be here at the Commonwealth Club. I had a chance to be here a couple of years ago, and I was just thrilled to come back.
You lost a bet last time.
I did lose a bet last time, and the last time I was here, I had to wear a San Francisco 49ers shirt after they had defeated the Detroit Lions for one of my friends who is here in the audience. But this time, she did me a favor. She got me something even better to wear, which is personalized and a Valkyries hat. So I say, go Valkyries!
Barb McQuade, sports writer turned prosecutor.
All true.
I mean, we were talking about, you started your career as a sports writer in college and then professionally, and you learned all those journalism skills that let you take notes and absorb information very quickly, and this book kind of feels like journalism. You're telling the story in the first part of the book of what's happened over the last 8+ years like I said, it feels like a prosecutor building a case. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I wanted to do was to take my experience as a prosecutor and talk about some of the tactics that I've seen in criminal cases, whether it's organized crime enterprises or corrupt public officials or con men, and talk about how those tactics seem to me to be some of the tactics we are seeing today from political leaders, namely one political leader. And I wanted to call it out, identify it, label it, and explain how it works, because I think that is the first step to solving a problem. And then in the same way, we were able to dismantle some of those criminal organizations. I think some of the same tactics can be used to dismantle what I see as a corrupt and mob-style government.
You can clap. You start almost every chapter, you start with a case, some history of another case in American history that is not related to the current president until the last one. Are you trying to say that what's happening now is the same kind of crime we've had throughout history? Is this different now? Are these the same kind of crimes that U.S. attorneys like you and your predecessors prosecuted for years, or is there something different going on now?
Well, what's different is it's happening from the President of the United States. One of the common threads that I see in this administration that has parallels to some of the cases we prosecuted is this idea of kind of mob-style tactics. It's the use of fear and intimidation, inflicting pain on a target, whether it's a rival or some other center of power or a critic, and coercing them to come to the table to negotiate their own punishment. You know, it's like the mobster who says, you know, this is a nice restaurant you have here. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. But if you will only pay me $5,000 a week, I'll watch out for you and make sure nothing bad happens, right? There's an understanding there that you have to do that. And early on in Trump's second administration, some of the tactics that we saw there, I thought brought some very stark parallels, like the dismissal of the Eric Adams indictment in New York, in exchange for a quid pro quo, how ironic in a bribery case, of agreeing to enforce President Trump's immigration agenda. And then the executive orders against law firms and universities, tariffs against our allies, frivolous defamation suits against the media. All of those things struck me as efforts to attack centers of power and get them to bow. And one of the things, you know, one of the stories I talk about in there is the case we prosecuted against the former mayor of Detroit, Kwame Kilpatrick. And one of his schemes was extortion. In the awarding of very lucrative public works contracts, he would demand kickbacks. And if companies wouldn't pay kickbacks, they wouldn't get the jobs. And these were contracts worth, you know, tens of millions of dollars. And so, you know, you got to pay back $100,000. Maybe that's worth the cost of admission. And so eventually, there was one contractor who testified at trial. He realized that if he wanted to be able to keep his employees working and his family fed, he was going to need to pay this kickback. But like all victims of extortion, I think, he thought that if I pay this one time, everything's going to be okay.
It always works out that way.
Yeah. You know, were you one of those kids, Neil, who like gave the bully your lunch money?
Maybe.
Because they always come back for more.
They do.
And that's what he learned the hard way. So he paid this kickback, he got the deal, but then what happened is they kept coming back for more. We're going to need another payment. We're going to need another payment. So he got to the point where they would call him and he'd go racing over with envelopes full of cash. Because what happens when there is extortion is the goal is to isolate and silence people so that they are owned by the person they paid off. And there's no one really you can turn to once you've done that, right? Because what are you going to do? Call the police and say, I paid a bribe and now they're making me pay more bribes. You're kind of on an island there.
Forever.
Forever, and unless you admit your own complicity. And so these are the tactics that I think we're seeing from this Trump administration. And until recently, we're starting to see some pushback. I think that the intimidation and the fear were effective in causing people to play along and to pay the bully and to pay the extortionist. And, you know, it works in organized crime. Turns out maybe it works in government, but only for a while. And ultimately, there are strategies we can use to counter both criminals and mob-style politics.
Which is interesting because we all sort of talk about, oh, it seems like the mob and it seems like a mob thing. But you've actually prosecuted mobsters and you've read about it. And you come at this from a perspective of, I don't know, it's almost like for everything that's happened in the Trump administration, there's a parallel crime somewhere else, right? Or there's a story. It's not new. It's like, just like you said, it's from a much higher level. Does this lead us to a blueprint for some kind of is there a prosecution? You refer in the book to the Nuremberg trials, where a sitting Supreme Court justice went over there and served as a prosecutor. My grandfather was part of that team. Is this a blueprint for a prosecution after the current president is perhaps out of office? I mean, do you just take the book and It's all there.
Yeah.
Right?
If it's there for the taking. I think one of the things that's really important is accountability. And we talk about the Nuremberg trials. I don't equate this to all that happened in Nazi Germany, but it was important that it be documented for history what had happened there. And I think in the same way, it is very important to document for history what has happened in this administration. I know there will be a temptation in 2029 for whoever is the next president to turn the page and to say, we need to move on, we need to look forward. But I think that would be a mistake. I come from Michigan, where we revere our only ever president of the United States, Gerald Ford.
Michigan alum.
And a Michigan alum, go Blue. But I think he made a mistake when he pardoned Richard Nixon. It probably seemed like the right thing, maybe to some, at least to him at the time. This idea of our long national nightmare is over, let's move on, let's turn the page. I can see the appeal of that. But as a prosecutor, I am a big believer in accountability. And I'm not so interested in accountability from a punitive retribution standpoint. I am about accountability as a forward-looking proposition for deterrence and public safety. And I think because Richard Nixon kind of got away with it, he got off the hook, then that perhaps enabled or fostered a Donald Trump. But if a Donald Trump is held accountable, then perhaps that deters whoever might come next, because people tend to build on the wrongdoing of others. They saw he got away with it. What can somebody else do that's perhaps even worse? So I think come January 20th at 12:01 in 2029, who is ever leading the Justice Department ought to renew the indictments that were filed by Jack Smith. They were filed without prejudice or dismissed without prejudice. They can be refiled and brought again, and I think they should be.
Anybody have any ideas? Anybody have any suggestions as to who should lead the Justice Department in 2029? Are you available? You mentioned public accountability and the justice. Isn't there also an element of public trust? You've got to be able to restore trust in institutions for government to keep functioning, starting with perhaps your favorite institution, the one you gave 20 years of your life to, the Justice Department.
Yes, I think that rebuilding the Justice Department after this administration is going to be critically important, but also incredibly difficult. I mean, one of the things that we are seeing, make no mistake, this Justice Department is operating as Donald Trump's personal Department of Retribution. This is not how the Justice Department is supposed to work. As somebody who worked in administrations of Republican and Democratic presidents, the goal was always that justice be done. It is not to win cases, it is to administer justice. And now we are seeing, an investigation into the wife of your governor here in California. Forgive me if I think that might be baseless. We just saw yesterday a judge in Minnesota quash subpoenas that were directed against Governor Walz and Mayor Fry there. And what they wanted to see is how you are responding to immigration enforcement in this community. We've seen, criminal charges against Jim Comey and Letitia James. And I worry that there will be cynicism as a result of this. Even if you have very honorable people who take over the Justice Department, whether in a Republican or Democratic administration, I worry that the damage has been done because of false claims that the Biden administration had weaponized the Justice Department, and now the actual weaponization that we are seeing by the Trump Justice Department. I think we need to do a couple things. I think first we need to do some really formal things, like codify some of the norms that are there. When I was working there, and I've got some friends here who are former DOJ attorneys, when we were there, there was a ban on communications between the White House and the Justice Department about specific cases. Now you see things like a direct message from the president directed to Pam. Why haven't we yet indicted Comey and James and Schiff? That just could not have been done. But
did you ever, under any of the Republican administrations you served under, was there ever a sense of pressure from Washington or intimidation, anything like that?
No, not at all. And, I just mentioned the Kilpatrick investigation and prosecution. He was a Democratic mayor. I served in the administration of Barack Obama. They never said a word to us about the case. we were independent and free to do what we wanted to do. So I think to restore that trust, we need to codify some of these norms. But I think the other thing we need to do is we need to have a president pledge on the campaign trail that his or her Justice Department will be completely independent from partisan politics. I think they need to pledge to that when they are campaigning. I think they need to select an attorney general who is independent. And I think they need to talk about it and live it throughout that administration. I think it's the only way to restore trust.
Sounds like a good note for the journalists who are covering the next presidential campaign to ask that question, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Or, confirmation hearings for the next attorney general.
Right. Not that you're thinking about those confirmations.
No.
So if there are to be some kind of charges, some kind of justice after this term is over, the Supreme Court kind of said the president's not responsible for anything. What can and can't be charged? Just hypothetically, if you had to think about what the charges are going to be, how do you decide what is and isn't going to stick? What can be done?
Yeah, so of course in 2024, the Supreme Court found that presidents are immune from prosecution for conduct that was committed within the scope of their official duties as the president. You may recall that what happened then was Jack Smith then went back to a grand jury and superseded the indictment to strip out all of the conduct that was alleged there that was within President Trump's official duties as president. Directing the Department of Justice to do certain things, for example. He took all that out. What was left was allegations based on Trump in his personal capacity as a candidate. So things like calling the Secretary of State of Georgia and saying, I need you to find me 11,000 votes, and building the false slates of electors in swing states. Those kinds of things are still there. So I think that the Justice Department could simply refile that indictment and resume the prosecution where they were. I think they could also resume the prosecution of the documents that were stored at Mar-a-Lago. And that one may seem like small potatoes, but man, those were some incredibly sensitive documents. They related to nuclear capabilities, our defense plans if we're attacked, our plans for protecting allies. And these documents, which were among the most sensitive in the U.S. government, were stored in a bathroom, in a ballroom, in Trump's personal office, and strewn all over the floor. And all of that conduct occurred after Trump had left office, so in his private capacity. I also think that if he had simply given those documents back, there may not have been a criminal prosecution. But for 18 months, he obstructed the investigation. He even had people moving the boxes around so that they couldn't find them when they came to visit. So I think both of those could be quite easily resuscitated.
And some state charges as well, right?
Well, there was the state case in Georgia. That one kind of went off the rails when Fani Willis, I think, made some very poor decisions about having a personal relationship with a subordinate. It became a great distraction. The merits of that case were never reviewed, which struck me as based on the language of the indictment being very strong. Remember that rogue grand juror who was doing television interviews? Remember her? She was like a young woman. She's like, whoa, wait till you see these charges. I think they were strong charges, but they kind of got derailed by that distraction. The case ultimately got reassigned to a different prosecutor who decided not to pursue the charges. But I think several states could bring charges if they wanted to, based on that. Michigan is one where there were efforts to usurp the power of the people to elect the candidate of their choice.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you, both in your own writing and your own work, and that you and your sisters-in-law do on the podcast, somehow you stay hopeful and positive. Not unrealistic, not Pollyanna or anything, but I think so many of us look at the news every morning and think, you read the news, you read Heather Cox Richardson, you read other stuff, you think, I don't even want to get out of bed.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, just give up. I'm going back under the covers. There's something about your combination of understanding how the law works and what's possible that it almost seems like, I don't know if it's manufactured or it just is naturally inside you, but there's this optimism that people seem to really need. Do you really feel that way? Of course you do, but do you work hard to manufacture it? Does it how can you be so optimistic at a time like this?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly realistic, and as you said, the first 2/3 of the book are some doom and gloom, with some candor, I think, of describing what we're seeing here.
Even in the first part of the book, most of the cases end with justice.
That's true. I think that for almost 250 years, our country has had moments of progress and moments of setbacks, but we have continuously moved toward a more perfect union. I think one of the lessons of history is it doesn't happen by itself. It requires all of us to work toward, bending that moral art. What is it? The arc of the universe, it bends toward justice, but it requires us to bend it. And I have faith in the American people. These 2 times we've elected Donald Trump have been a shock to me. But I think
you're not the only one.
Yeah, but I do see some cause for optimism now. I think that one of the things I learned in prosecuting con artists is eventually the con becomes revealed, because a con man can get away with his con for only so long before people realize they did not get what they bargained for. Whether it's land you bought in Florida or that 50% return on your investment with the stock markets that your investment advisor promised you. In the same way, remember the big issue in 2024 was the cost of eggs. I mean, inflation is rising. Donald Trump promised us no more foreign wars, and then he invaded Venezuela and Iran. The cost of gas is up. And somehow the thing that has really struck the imagination of the public and really gotten us angry is that algae in the reflecting pool. Like, we are so mad about that. Like, that is it. That is the last straw.
You thought it was going to be the Epstein files, but it's the algae.
Right? Who would have thought?
Taken down by a plant.
Yeah. Well, way to go. I think that reflecting pool is so apt as a metaphor.
It reflects.
There you go.
The current situation.
I see what you did there. Trying to have sort of a superficial solution to a problem, trying to stamp your own personal identity on it. They drained it and then he drove his motorcade through it, right? It's like marking one's territory like the way a dog does. And then we're going to paint it flag blue. He loves the flag. He dresses in red, white, and blue all the time. He's kind of putting his own stamp on there. And then he hires for the job a no-bid contract, some crony who is a donor.
Sounds very Detroit.
It reminded me of a lot of things that we've seen, who owns a company called, no joke, Greenwater. And, he fills it up, and no surprise, within just a few days, the algae is back. Because all they did was a superficial fix. To really fix the thing, you need to address the filtration and the water that comes in from the Potomac.
And then starts blaming other people for the problem.
Yes, and not only blaming them, but using the levers of power now to prosecute people for vandalism, for destroying government property. And I think everybody can see through this so clearly. And so I think that it's funny what can take down either a con man or a dictator.
Al Capone?
Al Capone, right, went down on tax charges and was right over here at Alcatraz, I believe,
yes.
in his imprisonment. So that does give me hope. I think that the history of our country is a resilient one, and it gives me hope that we'll get past this. But it's not going to happen just by wishing it so. It's going to happen the same way it has with every other struggle, whether it was the civil rights struggle, the Civil War, women's rights, the LGBTQ community, gay rights. All of those things required a lot of work and effort and organizing. And I think,
still aren't fully solved.
Right. And but to get past this moment, I think it's going to take that same kind of effort to try to restore. And I don't really care what your politics are. I don't care if our next president is a Republican or Democrat. But what I do care is about the rule of law and the pillars of democracy, which I think are essential to what America has always been.
The things we sort of used to take for granted, or we thought we could. Let's talk about another country's history, Hungary. Right, interesting outcome.
Yeah.
Took, 16 years to get there? Is that a parallel? Is there a lesson for America in what happened in Hungary?
I think there is. I think, of course, Hungary was sort of captured by Viktor Orban, who slowly degraded the institutions of democracy. He proudly referred to his government as an illiberal democracy, drove out universities, suppressed journalists. and really over time became an authoritarian leader in many ways, the same ways we see Donald Trump pandering to the religious right, talking about traditional values and other kinds of things. And I think it's appealing in a world where the pace of change is so rapid, and the world can be a frightening place. Everything is happening, things are changing, we feel threatened. But eventually, I think the con man got caught there as well. And so what his successful rival, Peter Magyar, was able to do is, number one, say, we're tired of fear, we're tired of hate, we're tired of intimidation. And what he did was unite the groups that Orban had divided, and bringing together people from progressive politics and populist politics, all of whom wanted a better life economically and who wanted to reclaim their national identity and their Hungarian patriotism. I think in the same way, whoever is our next president really needs to do the same, right? I mean, one of the strategies of Trumpism is to divide and conquer, right? Let's tell poor working class whites that the reason you are worse off than your parents' generation is not because of the billionaires who got the big tax cuts or deregulation or corporate spending on politics. No, that's not the reason. It's because of DEI, and it's because of people of color. It's because of immigrants. It's because of, special rights for the LGBTQ community, whatever it is. So an effort to drive a wedge between people who might otherwise be a voting bloc. I think whoever is the next president needs to have a vision to unite those people because, just as we've seen Zoran Mamdani do in New York, I think, issues like affordability and joy and bringing people together with unity, I think that is the secret sauce toward rebuilding America in the next
And
campaign
suspending
season.
bedtime during the basketball finals.
Yeah, right? Who doesn't love that? It's joy.
I was waiting for the parents' rights lobby to raise up against that. So Magyar, the guy who caused this, what happened in Hungary was during a presidential campaign, and there was a candidate on the other side really highlighting this stuff and bringing it up. When you say whoever's the next president has to do this, is that actually going to start during the campaign? Is somebody going to win on either side by leading people to where we go next? How much of this is on the shoulders of the next presidential candidate or candidates?
I think very much so. I mean, I think it's also on the 2026 midterm elections and candidates who are running for Congress. I think they need to, number one, expose and talk about Trump's corruption, his cruelty, his chaos, how our country is not better off than it was before. But I don't think that alone is enough. I don't think people want to just be against something. I think they want to be for something. What's the vision for the future? I can remember a time in 2008 when President Obama was first running for president. I wore this tan suit in his honor, by the way. Remember the hopey-changey stuff, as Sarah Palin called it. There really was hope for future, right? Like, what does America look like in its next iteration? I think historians will tell you we can't go back to something that was. I think, people want to go back to a time before Trumpism, before all this hatred and division. I don't think we're going back. It's a new world. We have AI to contend with. We have climate change to contend with, a world of technology. We have, 35 million Americans living in poverty. We have affordability issue, crisis in housing. The average age for a first-time home buyer is now 38. I'm guessing here in San Francisco, it's like, 78. It's, how do we address that? And there have to be good ways to do that. Let's work on solving some of these problems. And I think that whoever is next needs to talk about what that vision for the future looks like. And I think unity has to be part of it. I think affordability has to be part of it, but also just bringing together those disparate groups. One of the real parallels I talk about in the book that reminds me of where we are now is the Gilded Age, because we have this huge disparity in wealth that is growing and growing and growing. Just as we had the robber barons of the railroad industry and the oil industry and all those things. Today we've got, the tech barons. No offense to anyone who might be here in the crowd who is himself or herself a tech baron. Much respect. I love my devices. But there is a huge and growing wealth disparity. And what happened at the end of the Gilded Age, which gave us the Progressive Age, was a visionary leader like Theodore Roosevelt. He was a Republican, but he cared about reform because he saw things like monopolies that were gouging consumers and filthy working conditions with children in the workplace, and meat packing that was disgusting, and all of these things. And so he built a coalition of people who bought into, antitrust laws. Let's bust up these trusts so that we can have consumer power. Child labor laws. Let's get our kids out of the factories. Food and drug safety laws to protect us from whatever they're putting into our food. And the national park system. And he said we should preserve this beautiful land for the enjoyment of all, not just the wealthy people who can buy up the real estate. And that really reset the table. And I think it continued into Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, where he talked about the four freedoms of, speech, religion, freedom from fear, but one was freedom from want, making sure we have enough money for everybody. We should make sure that there are no people living in poverty. We understand it's a capitalist society and there will be some people who have more than others, but for the love of God, really? I mean, we're going to have homeless people in our streets when we've got other people who have super yachts? That's just not the way America should be. And so I think that if we can, thank you. If we can have, a leader who can bring that together, I think that's how we get from here to there.
Since we're here in San Francisco, not that you're in the prediction business, but is there another round of antitrust or something like what happened at the end of the Gilded Age coming for the tech industry here?
Yeah, I don't know about the tech industry. Frankly, I see the tech industry as being, with all these little startups and stuff, doing a pretty good job. There's been some big cases against Microsoft and Google, with bundling and other kinds of things. So maybe we'll continue to see that. But some of the industries where I think we've seen consolidation that's been very detrimental is in the media. I think everybody's now Paramount Plus, every media organization is now owned by Paramount. And
except CalMatters, but go on.
Except for CalMatters, there you go. And of course, that's harmful to the consumer. We have fewer choices, we have higher prices, everything gets bundled. And so that's bad for consumers. Banking is another one that has been very consolidated. And that's where you get all these, hidden fees and other things. When you try to go into your bank, they don't know you by name anymore. And, when you call for help, it's press 5 for this recording or that recording. And so I think that antitrust is, at the moment, kind of dormant, but I think vigorous antitrust enforcement is very important. And certainly in the tech industry, where it's in the recent past, we've seen some enforcement actions against some of the big tech companies. I think it's an important.
You started to touch on economic issues, the cost of housing, and I think the thing that surprised me most in the book, we'll talk a little later, you have some very specific laws and things that should be done, the fixes in the fixes part of the book. You went into some bigger issues about economic equality, about almost like toward universal basic income or finding ways to keep people. These are big societal changes that will take New Deal-sized efforts, as opposed to, can we fix this law, that law? Is that feasible? Is this country ready for another Franklin Roosevelt-style push to make that much change?
I think it is. I think for all of those disgruntled Trump voters who feel left behind, those are the ones who I think would be the most likely to jump in on this. I come from Detroit, a child of the auto industry, where we've had for a long time a lot of auto workers who feel left behind. Many of them became Trump voters because he promised them something, dignity and a better way of life, and making America great again, sort of promising the American dream of the 1950s when people could earn a good living on a working person's salary, an hourly wage. And you just can't have that life anymore. When I was growing up outside of Detroit, most of us had one parent working on the line at General Motors or Ford or Chrysler. And we could afford, 2 cars and a cottage up north and a pretty good life. And today, people see that I don't have that. And what, Trump has successfully done, it actually started with Ronald Reagan, is finding scapegoats to blame and enacting laws that have, over the past 40 years, increase this disparity in wealth between people. And so, we can blame minorities and DEI all we want, but the real culprit are these policies that have favored the wealthy. And so I think the time has come for whatever we want to call it, the Great Society or the New Deal. I mean, in a country as wealthy as ours, we should not have people who are as poor as we do. And there's so many people who are working very hard but can't make ends meet, while there are also, plenty of other people who are innovating and doing wonderful things, but getting, Elon Musk is a trillionaire. Have you read some of these stories about, like, if you stacked $100 bills on top of each other, they'd go to, like, the moon and back or something? I mean, it's obscene, the kind of wealth. And if you look at the tax rates of the 1970s, it was like 78% or something. Now nobody gets taxed at more than like 37%.
And most of them don't pay that much.
Well, yeah, I mean, you look at Donald Trump, right?
0% roughly?
He's paid anywhere from $0 to $750 in taxes. So, there are all kinds of ways of, treating business losses to avoid paying taxes if you know how to game the system. And so that's the kind of thing I think that needs a big reversal. So yes, I do think we need. I am a believer that. Policy, I don't know if it's big government, but effective policies can solve some of our problems. And I think it would be very appealing, not just to liberals, but also to the populists who feel like they've been left behind.
There's some questions here from the audience that parallel something I was going to ask you about, and a lot of them here saying this, roughly the same thing. Let's talk about the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
It is... I don't think it's an organization that people expected to be seen or discussed the way we have in the last few years, right? The public trust in it, I think it's safe to say, is, and the survey shows, lower. Lots of talk about how to change it. You're in charge. You run America. What do you do to the Supreme Court?
Yeah. So I think one of the problems on the Supreme Court is we've got this 6-3 supermajority. And so the balance is a little bit out of whack. There's a time when there were a lot of 5-4 decisions. There'd be a swing vote and, cases you couldn't really be sure which way they might go. Now you almost know from the minute they grant certiorari, when they say we're going to take this case, you almost know, I can see where this one's going. There would have been no reason for them to take the Dobbs case, for example, if they were simply going to reaffirm Roe versus Wade. And it got out of whack in part because of heavy-handed tactics by Mitch McConnell, right? When Antonin Scalia died, he said we can't possibly have a new justice in an election year, and so Merrick Garland's nomination dies on the vine. Then when Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, just 2 months before the election, he says, of course, Donald Trump can pick another justice. So as a result, Trump gets 3, and now we've got this 6-3 majority, so things are a little out of whack. I think one of the things that's been suggested, it's not an original idea, but it's an idea I like, is to have 18-year terms that are staggered. And I think it could be accomplished even without a constitutional amendment. So the Constitution says that there should be a Supreme Court in the judicial branch, and that they should serve for life. It says as long as they have good behavior. So I think one way around this is to do what Congress has done in such other courts as Congress shall create in lower courts, which is to create a class of active judges and senior judges. You could have a class of active justices and senior justices. So when a justice gets to be at a certain point in their, after 18 years, they rotate onto the senior bench, and they do things like review cert petitions or emergency petitions that come out of the circuit courts. So they'd still have something to do. And then you could have an active set of justices who are appointed 3 justices in every presidential term in a staggered way, so that every president gets 3, and the people, can have some say in that by who they elect president. And I think that it takes some time. It would take a few terms to get some balance there. But I think it would prevent sort of the serendipity of one president getting, 3 justices when some presidents get none at all, because they stay for a long time. Life terms, Amy Coney Barrett, I think, is she even 50 yet? I don't know.
People live longer now, right?
And they live longer. She's going to serve on that bench for 40 or 50 years. It's a very long time, and I don't think the founders really imagined that would happen. I think they thought that this was something for elder statesmen. They would get this job, they would serve for life, which, in those days maybe was, it was maybe 10 or at most 20 years.
Yeah. What about changing the number of justices?
Yep, I think this is one that could also be done without constitutional amendment. As you may know, the number of justices currently is 9, but throughout our nation's history, it has been anywhere from 5 to 10. And the number is set by Congress. The Constitution does not specify a number. 9 was set at a time when we had 9 judicial circuits. And that made some sense because one of the tasks of a justice is to ride circuit. Back in the day, they used to actually get on their horse and like go to the circuit. You know, if there was one for, say, the Ninth Circuit here in California and related states, they'd run, come out here and they would get the cert petitions and decide what gets granted. But now we have 13 circuits. So maybe the time has come to have 13 justices that might, and I think by just having more, it would bring a diversity of viewpoints in theory. And so you might have better decisions because you would have different perspectives represented on the court. So I think that's something that could happen. If we were to do that, though, I don't think you'd want to give any one president 4 picks. You might want to stagger that as well over time. But I think that's a number that makes some sense.
Is there either political or legislative support for that? Does it feel realistic that it could happen? Either one of those?
Yeah, I don't know. As I said, it would really just be an act of Congress. So if you had perhaps a majority in Congress and in the Senate that wanted to pass that and a president who was on board, it could be done with legislation and a president who's willing to sign it into law. It would not require a constitutional amendment, which is certainly much harder to get through.
Other things that you've talked about, the election system, the way we pick representatives, the way the Electoral College works, the fact that Wyoming and California have the same number of senators with slightly different population, not that we're begrudging that. One of the things you suggest is people don't feel well represented.
Yeah.
And if we can fix the way people are represented, make it more proportional, that's going to bring people back in more engaged, right? They're going to have more faith in the institution. Talk about the ways you might want to see us do that.
Yeah, and I think not only would it make people feel more engaged, I think we could also have a more vigorous Congress if we had people who were representing the interests of the people as opposed to the interests of, special interest and big money and other things. In this country, we have something like 85% of seats in Congress that are not in play in any election. Only, like 15 to 19% of the seats in Congress flip from red to blue. They are entrenched. And as a result, I think that there are people who think, well, I live in a community where my member of Congress is always going to be a Republican. I have no say. They don't really represent me, but what am I going to do about it? And I think there's some things we could do about it. One is ranked choice voting, I think, is something that has worked well in some states.
We have it here in the city.
That's fantastic. It has a moderating effect. Like Lisa Murkowski is a senator from Alaska who was selected with ranked choice voting, and she's been a pretty moderate voice in the Senate. I think that's one. I think ending gerrymandering would be really important. And that can be done. We've done it in my home state of Michigan. We have, and it came up through a ballot proposal. I know you have a ballot proposal system here in California, to amend our Constitution to create an independent citizens redistricting commission.
We did that, and then we broke it.
And then you decided you wanted to gerrymander anyway. Well done, California.
I think we blame Texas.
Yeah, I know.
I'm pretty sure we said it was Texas's fault.
Yeah, I don't love the idea of gerrymandering. I understand why the need was felt to counter what is happening in other parts of the country. But if we could get everybody to stop gerrymandering through these independent citizens redistricting commissions, we could get rid of gerrymandering. We did it in Michigan several years ago, and after the new districts were redrawn, Michigan, for the first time in 40 years, elected Democrats to the state House, the state Senate, and the governor's office. First time in 40 years because it finally reflected the will of the people. So I think getting rid of gerrymandering nationwide could be important. But the other one is called proportional representation. And this one's a little bold. That's euphemism for like it's kind of crazy. It's kind of bold.
It takes some explaining.
Yeah.
Because I had to read it twice.
Yeah, but the idea is that in each congressional district, instead of having only one member of Congress, you might have, say, 5 members of Congress. So, for example, my home district is Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we are represented by Debbie Dingell, who is a wonderful member of Congress. She's a Democrat. But say, for example, we are 60% Democratic voters and 40% Republican voters. But that's just a solidly blue seat. She's had the seat for years. She's locked it up. She's going to be there for as long as she wants to be there. And when she leaves, some other Democrat's going to have it. So that means that for the 40% of Republicans in our district, they don't really have their values represented in Congress. But what if we had 5 members of Congress? So Debbie Dingell still gets her seat, but that means we get, say, of our 60% of Democrats, maybe 3 Democrats get elected and 2 Republicans who go to Washington to represent people. So now everybody gets someone who represents their values. And what also tends to happen in these kinds of systems is we tend to have some people who gravitate to the far right and the far left, and some people who become moderate. And maybe we even end up creating more than 2 political parties. If you've ever felt like you don't have a home in either party, maybe this kind of proportional representation could create something that's, farther right and left and more moderate, so that everybody finds a home in politics. I think it could be very healthy for our democracy, where it's not just an either-or kind of choice. And then when it comes to the Electoral College, man, you in California have really got a raw deal here. You have really lost your power to have influence in the presidential election. So we could either get rid of the Electoral College through a constitutional amendment, have a popular vote, or there's this popular vote compact, the multi-state popular vote compact. Some of you probably know about this. And that is states have agreed, and we only need 5 more states. Many states have already signed on to this. They say if we get enough states to join in where we can get to the number of electoral votes it takes to elect a president, we will pledge all of our electoral votes to the popular vote winner. And so in that way, they can kind of circumvent the Electoral College and deliver all of their electoral votes, sufficient number, to the popular vote winner. So it's a way of achieving a popular vote without amending the Constitution.
To bring up a position that I don't necessarily endorse, what do you say to the person in Wyoming or Delaware who says, if you just go with the popular vote or you go get rid of the Electoral College, you've given all the power to California and Texas? That's a vote for.
Yeah.
Are you in Congress?
I mean, that's where the people live. There's this goes back to a compromise from the times of the founding of the Constitution. They couldn't figure it out. They couldn't reach an agreement, right? The populous states wanted one thing, the small states wanted another, so they kind of threw up their hands and said, well, we'll do this compromise. But that doesn't mean it's the best forever. And as populations have shifted, and we've seen states grow very, very large and others that are much smaller, we now have, I think, skewed representation where we've got kind of a tyranny of the minority, where minority states and viewpoints are dictating the policy of our country. If we looked at where the people live and where popular vote is and popular sentiment is, the policies of our Congress and of our president do not reflect the will of the people. So that's what I would say to those people in Wyoming and Delaware. Move to California.
I didn't see Wyoming on your book tour.
No.
Yeah. So you're probably okay. Interesting question from the audience, and this is something you referred to in the book, just some real specific laws. We're big fans here of the First Amendment in the business we're in journalism. Could it be illegal for a politician to lie? Could you restrict legally politicians from lying?
Yeah, this is a really interesting proposition. Andrew Weissman has a book out called Liar's Kingdom. I shouldn't plug another book, but it's a very good book.
Buy them both.
Yeah, buy them both. He actually endorses a view that the answer is yes. So one thing to keep in mind is that although we all treasure the First Amendment, I most certainly do, and I'm sure all of you do as well, remember that like all rights, the rights of free speech are not absolute. So for example, you cannot, the famous, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, don't anybody try it. There's this thing called strict scrutiny. And the courts have held that if Congress or states restrict a right, they have to have a compelling reason to do so, and the law must be narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling goal. And so, for example, we have passed laws that make it a crime to communicate a threat because there's a compelling reason. We don't want people going around threatening each other, and it's very narrow. It talks about a threat to injure or kill a person that a reasonable person would believe expresses a genuine intent to do so. So you put enough qualifiers on it. You can't commit perjury where you're lying in court or on an official document. You can't make fraudulent statements. I want to sell you some swampland in Florida. And so in the same way, I think we could have, if we tailored it narrowly, we could make certain statements criminal that are false. Now, I think Andrew's proposal is that they be very specifically related to things like fraud in election results, that are baseless. And I think he even has a willfulness component, which means not only that it was false, but that you knew it was false and that you knew it was unlawful at the time you did it. So putting enough qualifiers on that. I think we could do that. Now, just the kind of puffery and political talk that politicians engage in, I don't think so. I mean, I think that politicians, talk about things that they want to do prospectively. Those aren't necessarily lies. Those might be more pie in the sky aspirations. I don't think you could criminalize that. But if you could be narrow enough about false statements pertaining to baseless election fraud, I think there might be room that would pass constitutional muster.
Like words would incite a riot, for instance.
For example, just hypothetically.
Which in theory should already be illegal. There are a number of folks asking about the part of our electorate, the part of the country that is all in for Trump. The pickup trucks, the flags, he had to do that or Iran would have had a bomb, that kind of thing. And how you bring, if you bring that part of the population to a place somewhere maybe more toward the center, or have we never really been in a situation where everybody agreed and you just have to let some group of people are always going to disagree? How much do you think about those folks? You've got neighbors in Michigan who are that way very much. Sure. How do you reach them? Do you reach them? Do you try to? Is it a priority? And if so, how?
Yes, I think you have to try. I don't think you're ever going to get 100% of the electorate. I think that, one of the things that Trump has done very effectively is tap into racism, white supremacy, homophobia, xenophobia. And I think there are people who love him for that. And I don't think we're ever going to get past those. But I also think that there are certain people who are open-minded who vote on kitchen table issues. And I think those are the people you need to reach. One of my own senators from Michigan is Alyssa Slotkin, who I like very much. Before she was a senator, she was a member of Congress in a very purple district. And one of her strategies was to go out and campaign to some of the people who are, in the reddest parts of her district. And her goal was, I want to lose by less in these parts of the district. And she got out and talked to people, and she realized that one of the things that many people in her district had in common were these kitchen table issues. And so she really tried to focus on those things. What are the things we have in common? What are the things we want to achieve? And focus on those, and try to focus less on those divisive things. Like one of the campaign ads Donald Trump ran last time was, Kamala Harris is for they, them. Donald Trump is for us. That was an issue that I'm sure resonated with a lot of people. But, instead of focusing on divisive issues, where can we find common ground? And I think common ground can be found in areas like economic issues. And so there are always going to be people who are homophobes and racists who are going to take the bait, and maybe you can't win them over, and we probably shouldn't try. But I think that if you can find common ground on issues that matter to everybody, you can win back, I think, a lot of those voters. There are a lot of people who voted for Barack Obama and Donald Trump. How do you bridge that group? Those are the people that you need to find.
There are people who say, my life was tough or lousy or hard under Bush, under Clinton, under Bush, under Obama, under Biden, under Trump. Like, they're always going to vote for the other person because it was always difficult. Their life was difficult no matter what. Barack Obama might have been a nice guy, but he didn't fix my personal situation, right? It's hard to make people be thinking about what's going on in the world when they're trying to do 3 jobs and take care of somebody. But you mentioned Alyssa Slotkin going to those districts in person, going to those neighborhoods in person, talking to people. Isn't it different when you're in person with somebody versus on a keyboard? It is harder
Sure.
face to face to have that kind of animosity and hate. Is part of the solution people actually talking to each other in person?
I think it's absolutely part of it. So one of the things I talk about in the book is what we can do ourselves to help take back our democracy. And there are lots of things, voting and protesting and getting involved in grassroots organizations like the League of Women Voters or Indivisible, or the Commonwealth Club. There are lots of great ways to tap in. But I think one of the things we all can do to be sort of ambassadors for democracy is talk to the people around us. And it can be difficult. But research shows that we are most influenced by the people around us. It's why those of us who went to Michigan, wear things like ridiculous maize and blue socks or a Michigan watch. We think it's cool. But you are very influential among your friends, family, neighbors, and maybe here in San Francisco you don't have that uncle the way we do in Michigan, and.
12% of people in San Francisco voted for Trump.
Oh, well.
And I know the person on my block.
Well, then you've got a job, Neil, is to go talk to them. There's some people who are going to be a lost cause. But I think for many people, there is this narrative that the elites on the left look down upon them and ridicule them, and this is their comeuppance. It's why there's this movement on the right that loves to own the libs and bait the libs and get them all upset and angry and clutching their pearls, as they say, and all of those kinds of things. I think the way to talk to people is by showing respect and curiosity, and not saying like, how on earth can you believe that? That's not the kind of curiosity I'm talking about. Genuine curiosity. There's room for dialogue, and I think we have to meet people where they are. And, there's this thing called empathetic listening, where you ask people about an issue or a candidate, and you have to be willing to actually listen. And, once they tell you their views, ask, what do you base that on? Do you have evidence to support that? Or have you read anything? Do you have anything I could read? And, get them to think about, do I have any evidence for that? Or is it more about vibes and more about emotions? And if they do produce something for you, you read it, and then you go back to them and say, I appreciate what you shared with me, and I read it, and, may I share something with you? And now you've opened up a dialogue, and maybe you can get them to think a little differently about the issue. You probably won't get them to change their mind today. You may not even get them to ever admit to you they've changed their mind. But if you can just plant a seed, or suggest that there's a different way of looking at things, then you will have achieved, I think, some of the unity that we so desperately need. And so think of yourself as an ambassador for democracy and try to lean into some of those conversations in a respectful and curious kind of way.
If you can get the tone down to how on earth, that's huge progress from where we are now, right? A number of questions here about the unitary executive theory.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about on the podcast, Sisters-in-Law, which we all will be listening to. And the idea that if the current president can get away with what he's done, doesn't that just embolden the next rounds of leaders to be even worse? And are we on a path that is, I'm going to say hopeless, knowing that hope is the thing you do, so make it not hopeless.
Yeah, well, this is a tough one because I think the unitary executive theory is really hogwash. That's a legal term.
That is the strongest term you'll ever hear from Barb.
Yeah, it really is. When I was in law school, there was no such thing as the unitary executive theory. I mean, we learned that Congress can put limits on the executive branch because...
So cute.
Yeah, right? Isn't it adorable? And, Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, is very fond of, it's so interesting. He was an assistant U.S. attorney, but he spent a long time as a criminal defense attorney. And no offense to my friends.
Which criminal was he defending?
Yeah. No offense to I know I've got some friends in the room who are criminal defense attorneys. But one of the strategies you use, do you not, is to take a bad fact and really lean into it, right? You don't deny it. You say, of course he had the smoking gun in his hand. Where else would it be? Of course. That's what makes him so innocent. Who would pick up a smoking gun if they'd actually murdered somebody? Of course.
You could be good at that.
Yeah. So, Todd Blanche has really leaned into this idea that, of course, Donald Trump is directing the Department of Justice because, after all, he's the president. And then he reaches into his coat pocket and he pulls out his pocket constitution and he reads the vesting clause, the one that says the executive branch shall be vested in a president of the United States. See, it's his job, it's his duty, it's his responsibility to run everything. That's what he does. What he doesn't tell you is the other part of Article 2, which says the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so Congress is the one who passes the laws, and the president is just supposed to administer them. As far back as 1935, the Supreme Court decided a case called Humphrey's Executor. Humphreys was a guy who was a federal trade commissioner who got fired in violation of a federal statute that said they get to serve for a term of 14 years or something like that. The idea being we want to surpass any presidential administration to keep it apolitical. He died and his estate wanted his back wages. And so they sued. And the Supreme Court said, of course Congress can restrict the president in this way and tell him who he can and can't fire. The current makeup of the Supreme Court, though, are people like John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh and Samuel Alito. Two of them have been working since the Reagan administration to advance this idea of the unitary executive theory. That is, the president runs the whole executive branch. He gets to call the shots. Congress can't tell him what to do. This will roll back more than 100 years of the professional civil service if the president can just fire anybody at will. Since 1883, when we passed the Pendleton Act, we have had an independent and professional civil service. It's like the crown jewel of the American government, that we've got experts who are independent. And of course, Trump calls them the deep state because he wants to be able to control them. And so I'm very worried that Chief Justice John Roberts has referred to Humphrey's executor as a dry husk of a precedent. Whatever happened to, I'm just an umpire calling the balls and strikes. I think that this term,
Which he actually said once.
During his confirmation hearings, again, how cute was that? I think they're going to overturn Humphrey's executor in this case called Slaughter. I think they're going to rein in the unitary executive theory when it comes to the Federal Reserve Board. What's the difference? They say it's because it has origins that are quasi-private in the First National Bank. But I think the real reason is they don't want to screw up the money because they got 401ks too. So that's a very cynical view. So what do we do about it? I don't know that there's any quick fix for it, but I think one of the things that people who care about good government ought to think about is, just as the Federalist Society got their ducks in a row after Roe versus Wade and spent 50 years building a strategy to dismantle that by growing new crops of law students and judges, I think that those who care about the pillars of democracy need to begin their work to dismantle the unitary executive theory. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it is a restoration of the view of the founding fathers who, after all, were trying to free us from a monarchy, not create one.
We're getting close to the end of our time, but there's a question here that's more personally about you, and I'm guessing from one of the students we have with us tonight. When you and I first met, you were a sports writer at the Michigan Daily, writing a column called Barb's Barbs.
It's true.
It is available online.
With some regrettable hair in my...
See, I was going to bring that up, but there's a picture online of that too. The question is, how did you decide to go into the law? And I think it's more than just what made you want to be a lawyer, but what drives you to do what you ended up doing, to be a prosecutor, to do the book, to do what you like. What made you go from being a sports writer, writing about the best teams in college sports, but I digress, and drove you to what you're doing now?
Yeah, if I could put it into one word, I guess that word would be equality. There are two defining aspects of my childhood that I think drive who I am today. One is I loved sports. I had a girl dad. We didn't have any brothers. And so I really enjoyed watching and playing sports with my dad. And I was going to be the next shortstop for the Detroit Tigers until I was told girls can't do that. So I said, well, okay, then I'll run for president of the United States, and was told girls can't do that either. And I was really angry about to learn these things because I had been told in America anything is possible and you can be anything you want to be. And that disgusted me, and I wanted to change that. And I think I have throughout my career, worked to try to undo these injustices. That was one thing. The other was my earliest kind of current events memory was of the Watergate hearings. I was a child in the 1970s when those hearings were going on, and I can remember asking my mom what Watergate was, and she told me correctly, but in a very misleading way, that Watergate was an office building, and that really blew my mind. What?
True.
I thought it was a scandal, but I knew it was something the president had done that was bad, and I revered the office of the presidency, and the idea that someone could be entrusted with this job and then betray the people, to me, was the worst thing a person can do. And so to see these reporters like Woodward and Bernstein be able to hold a president accountable, and these Congress members be able to have these hearings and hold someone accountable, I think really led me to an interest in a career both in journalism and in the law. The idea of holding people accountable when they abuse the public trust. I think the equality of all of us as the people, that the power comes from us, is very important to me. And using our power to correct these injustices in the world is something all of us can do.
I love that. The book is The Fix, Saving America from the Corruption of a Mob-Style Government. One of our Michigan alums here from the law school shared with me the New York Times bestseller list from Sunday. This book is at number 5. But as a sports writer, number 5 is pretty far down in the rankings, right? So we thought, let's get it to number 1. And then we look at number 1, and this is a book by Dr. Jill Biden. So maybe we can go for 2. The book is on sale out in the lobby. Barb is going to be here signing books.
Yes.
Really appreciate you being here and the work you do and the messages you're sharing. Barb McQuaid, thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you.